But there was one of a topic today which goes outside the tradition. We like to challenge you and think not just about the A2P business as it is, but as it could be or as it should be. And that's one of the topics, as I said, in the past we have covered as well. I'm very glad to say there is another topic over the time we built with the help of Chris Lewis, which is the people with disability topic. And looking at them as we do in an ecosystem, as a clear sustainability issues with our customers, 10%, rule number one, quantify that. 10% we found the world populations has some disabilities at some point. And there is great to know that there is not just some of those numbers and theories, there's new tools we could use. And in an omni-channel world, aren't you the best person to provide the different reach to the different data? So Metaverse is now a report from Chris Lewis. You can download it on our website, and the role of omnichannel is clearly in that. Now, welcome. I see that you set yourself at home. We got here Chris Lewis, as I mentioned, but also Dr. Mike Short, CBE, and Volley over there. Well, a couple of words. I hope, Mike, you feel at home here. Well, you are. But in '98, you were one of the operators, head of technology at BT Cellnet, as it was at the time, working interconnections of asbestos, I believe. We owe to you part of all of this. Operators decided that they could send messages across the different people. And that was only, well, a few decades ago. But today, the Chief Scientific Advisor of the Department of International Trade, fantastic to have you here. Fantastic to have Chris. I will just make myself start.
Thank you, Dario. And nice to be here back. And thank you very much for giving me the chance to look at the report and look at that subject. And obviously the metaverse captures people's attention. But given that I think Mike and I, between us, I think we have 80 years experience looking at the industry. But I'd like to say we're looking forward most of the time. But I think in terms of addressing this topic of people with disability, or perhaps this topic more importantly called inclusion, I think that's really, we do need to go back. And Mike, you were kind enough to commission me, I think almost 10 years ago now, to look at the market for disability and try to put some numbers around it. And how do you see that journey? Where have we come with that journey, and where are we today?
Well, first of all, I was a vice president of Telefonica for a number of years. I finished in 2017. But when we commissioned that report, it was very obvious that people weren't thinking about disability as a market. They weren't thinking about age as a market. They weren't thinking about inclusion as a market. And when we acknowledged that perhaps 40% of the world still don't have access to the internet, even today, you can see the size of the gap and the opportunity to fill that gap. So it was driven by commercial reasons. And I think people now talk about accessibility and inclusion on a more routine basis. I think the second thing is that we can see how technology has moved on to be more inclusive, particularly when we look at smartphones. It's not inclusive enough, but it's moved on. So we can actually see that techniques such as text to speech or speech to text are more widely available. We can see that the visual world is enabled, but not just by FaceTime, but all sorts of other video capabilities, some of which actually bridge the geographic divide as well as the inclusion divide. We still need to do more in areas like labeling, particularly labeling of content. If you're visually impaired, you don't always get the labeling or the verbal feedback from something which is visual, such as messaging. But actually the text to speech has really helped a lot in the last few years. I think as we go forward, we can also see those who have dexterity issues will be using more and more haptics for haptic feedback or haptic and sensory activity. I think there's a lot more we can still do, but I think we've made good progress in the last 10 years.
And what's fascinating is that having grown up as a visually impaired person going to a blind school, I had very expensive, very clunky equipment. And one machine, a Kurzweil reading machine, which literally cost $100,000, which was one of the early OCR devices, which obviously scans a book. That's now on my phone as pretty much a free app. So I think that miniaturization of the technology has also changed things significantly. And of course, in the past, we dealt with each disability in isolation. So we dealt with visually impaired, with hearing impaired, with cognitive, with physically impaired. And therefore, it never reached any scale. And one of the things that I think you wanted to point out, and whether that was Telefonica or you obviously previously the chair of the GSMA as well, so you're much broader view of the industry, was that the mobile device is a way of bringing things together. And so that mobilization, the miniaturization, and the softwareization of everything that we do actually opens up so many opportunities. And by the way, and text-to-speech is being used in my right here at the moment to remind me of any questions I forget to ask you. So, it is an unbelievably important. But I think the other thing which the audience should really take on board is that the expansion of channels of interaction that we have with our devices, with the internet, all these things are, of course, they help people like myself with a vision problem or someone with a hearing problem, but they also help the mainstream market as well. One of the things that we touch upon in the report is that in the past, we've designed for a relatively narrow market. We talk about the mainstream market, and of course, that's what commercial design development does. So we've designed for that. But, that may well be, if I can be politically a little bit incorrect, is a sort of white Anglo-Saxon polo shirt wearing male. And with these extraneous, these peripheral examples that we've talked about, whether it's of disability or the others we'll touch on in a second, they were left out to be designed afterwards. And actually, it's like you say, it could be 40%, it could be even more of the market. But the potential to wrap all this immersive stuff around people and allow them to engage and communicate in the way they want to. And I put to you, Mike, that actually in the past, we have, as an industry, we've encouraged forced people to do things in a certain way. So the technology limitations have meant you will make a phone call, you will, use a certain messaging service, whatever. But the expansion now to this software-based industry is that actually we can begin to manipulate things around everybody. Do you see a lot in that?
I do, but I think if we think about the evolution of the web itself, with the multiplication of content that's now available and social media and so on, that inclusion issue is not just about having a variety of content, it's also making sure it's accessible to a wider variety of people. And I think the area of search, typing in is fine to do search if you like to do that, but not everybody has the ability to do that. So what about voice-based search? Mm-hmm. What about some other techniques that actually might find you things, such as smart speakers? How do you actually open up access to this vast library called the World Wide Web? There is more and more on the World Wide Web, but it has to be accessible. If you look to some parts of the world, you don't get necessarily local language content. So inclusion of local language in parts of Africa is a reason why you don't get new iPhones, for example, sold in some of those countries. Or they don't have apps in the App Store geared towards local languages. So language translation needs to come into this. But I also think the labeling story, particularly on the web, needs a lot more work so that people feel included in local languages, but also in an inclusive, accessible way.
So that takes me back to my original degree a long time ago, which was in machine translation, translating language to language, which is, trying to do pairs of French to German, German to English for the European Commission. But when you start to deal with many of the glottal stops that exist within the African languages, it really does pose some phonetic and other issues. So you're absolutely right. So it's bringing everybody into this market. I want to narrow it down just before we take it too far forward and think about our industry and the way people interact with the telecoms industry and the customer experience. We hear a lot about customer experience today, and a lot of people have said it's either mobile first or digital first. But are we not missing the point? Are we not just following the technology by doing that? And should we not really think about human first?
Well, I think the human first approach has to be a key marketing dimension, isn't it? I think if we think technology first, I think we'll miss lots of markets along the way. But I think also if you start to say human or people first, you've got to be thinking about all the senses, the hearing, the speaking, the breathing, the smelling. No, we don't yet have a smelly phone, but actually we might want to serve all the senses in time. So how do we actually address the human and all the senses? That's why I mentioned briefly the haptic capability, because that sensory behavior will become more important. We also need to keep an eye on cost to make sure that the R&D is spread across many countries and many markets. So having standards really helps in that area. That's really why I'm mentioning things like labeling, because labeling has to be based on a standard that's consistently applied everywhere. To me, I think the sensory behavior needs to have more of a flavor of common sense about it. How does common sense get designed in by the designer for everybody who may need that communication capability? I think the other trend we've seen is a big shift from the verbal to the visual world. Mobile was built on hearing and speaking largely, and then moved to messaging, but is increasingly in that visual world where we need to have interpretation of what the visuals mean. And if you're blind, you have an issue. Some of the sound quality issues affect old people as well. And we need to think about background noise and volume and clarity of the volume if it is a verbal message.
And there's a really important issue here, which is that we talk about the people with disability, which is roughly 1 billion people in the world. It's a big number, 15% roughly on average in countries. But then the elderly population who are perhaps less digitally aware. And then, of course, the people who are economically not connected because of the cost. And then the uneducated who perhaps aren't even aware of what they might be able to do. So I think the awareness campaign for everybody is extremely important. But one thing I do want to point out to everybody is that even though we, as an analyst, we're always putting people into categories and segmenting the market, the visually impaired and hearing impaired, and physically impaired and cognitive, actually there is a significant overlap in the Venn diagram of those categories. So especially with elderly people, we need to make sure that all of these services work seamlessly, that they're not isolated. And I'll give you a very practical example, which is that I've actually damaged the hearing in my right ear. So I'm now playing with hearing aids to see how I can complement things. But I use VoiceOver on my iPhone to generate text-to-speech so I can read everything, any message that Mike or Susan or Dario or anybody sends me. The conflict between using that and connecting hearing aids through an iPhone is a real pain, because it means I can't use both things properly at the same time. So the design issue, we need to make sure that design criteria doesn't just come in from the inside of the telecoms organization and the customer experience people, but also in the devices and the accessibility built into devices. Because it's important that we allow for, many people in this room. And of course, the good thing is I can't see how old you are. You're all looking great and young and fresh-faced and whatever. But actually, at some point, the deterioration will kick in, and we need to be able to use all these things. So to be able to choose how you absorb information, how you create information, how you interact with your telecom provider or whoever is really, really important. And I think that's one of the biggest changes. It used to be a CSR issue. We often couch it in ESG terms now. And then there's another acronym, which I don't know whether you're familiar with, Mike, but EDI, which is Equality, Diversity and Inclusion, which, of course, not the old EDI standard that we're perhaps more used to in the telecom world. But the good news is this is now, and I just came off a call before I came in here, BT, with the CEO of BT presenting their ESG manifesto and talking about inclusion for generating employment opportunities within BT, but also how that extends through customer experience to its customers, and making allowance for they did call them vulnerable, which I wasn't quite sure, but perhaps we should call them priority customers who need that extra requirement. But I think you're right, Mike. Perhaps one issue that as we slightly move it forward, looking a bit, Web 3.0, is that something that's been hitting your radar at the DIT in the last 5 years? You've been doing it now, I think.
So I've been Chief Scientific Advisor in international trade for 5 years, and we're getting more and more demands from businesses to look at Web 3.0, whether it be things like holograms or NFT, non-fungible tokens, maybe the ability to transfer and sell assets internationally, maybe also helping deliver the metaverse, however you define it, possibly including blockchain and distributed ledger technology. And whilst this may sound like a string of technologies, there is actually growing business interest in this area. Lots of startups in this area, lots of risk being taken, but also opportunities being seen. And when we think about Web 3.0, typically people think about it being a 3D world of new standards, the latest generation of the web. And as a three-dimensional world, it implies it's much more visual again. It also implies it's a much more international market driven by the evolution of the internet itself. But I think when we see some of the sports stars already with their NFTs, or some of the art galleries with their NFTs and beginning to sell them, it clearly is a new market that we need to consider how to trade and support. So there are increasing, what I'd say, metaverse type trade events where metaverse plays a part alongside Web 3.0.
But I think what I always love about talking with you is the reach of the role you've had both before when you were within the telecom industry and now within the Department of International Trade, about the sorts of companies coming through and the different industries, because we've been very insular within the telecom industry, looking at our own issues, and actually the innovation coming in. Do you want to touch upon some of the, you mentioned some of the startups, some of the innovations coming in from some of the other sectors?
I mean, I was at Harwell this morning looking at some of the interest in the space area, in the quantum area, but also in the digital area. And how do we support that for inward investment into the UK and into that great science park called Harwell? It started off as part of the atomic weapons establishment. It was very much an atomic facility. But 70, 80 years on, it's much more diverse in terms of the science and innovation. We also have in the UK over 300 incubators and accelerators. We actually lead in Europe in that area. Huge incubation, huge innovation of startups, many spinning out from universities because of our strong universities, but also lots and lots in the digital space. Digital health, digital financial and fintech, digital this, digital that. And I think what we find is a lot of investment coming into the UK is attracted by that innovation. It also needs to look at, though, the markets it's going to serve. And we happen to be blessed in the UK with lots of big multinational companies that are able to take some of those ideas and grow them, not just in the UK, but internationally. And when we think about the metaverse, a lot of the creative industries players or the multinationals wanting to do that are beginning to think about how do you offer digital assets which could add value to their product line or their services. And whether it's NFT or whether it's distributed ledger technology, there is growing interest in that area.
So the metaverse. In fact, by the way, can I brand Dr. Mike and the Metaverse as a band name for the future? I think I quite like that. So this metaverse thing, people are jumping on the bandwagon. They're talking about it a lot. You've touched upon it with Web 3.0 and the issues of blockchain, all these issues. First of all, do you see it from your point of view more consumer, more business? And where are the opportunities in both areas do you see at the moment? Let's accept it's quite a long way out still, but it's fun and interesting to think about.
Well, I think some of the creative industries, whether it's in sport or entertainment or games, are already sharing 3D graphics. So those 3D graphics are being a business-to-business transfer probably initially. But I think their end game in many cases is business to consumer. So I think we're going to see more in the way of holograms, more ideas of 3D imaging, more forms of 3D conferencing in the future. So that presents a challenge because often these are very visual and may not be appreciated by people who are visually impaired. So that also relates to, well, how are you going to label them to make sure that they remain inclusive? How are you going to label them to make sure that everybody can use these techniques? It's not just a new technology divide, it's possibly a new digital divide for accessibility and inclusion.
But I think there's the flip of that, of course, is that if we include inclusion, I can do that, at the beginning of the process, and if when people are designing the next generation of gaming or interaction or collaboration, as you say, then as long as the tags are, to your label point, the tags are in the right place, the APIs, to go back to the previous conversation, as long as they're open enough and people are aware of them, actually, there's a really interesting sort of simulation job we can do here about how someone like myself experiences a room like this when I come into it, how I can interact better, how the communication could be focused towards me, and we can learn from that. So actually, it takes us right back into the world of computing and modeling. And does the metaverse basically model life and give us a digital twin of life through which we can learn and feed information back to the real world?
It could do that, but we already see with things like VR and AR and XR, immersive reality, those sort of areas, people are using those as training tools today to visualize what may be inside a building or what may be inside the classroom. And the metaverse is an extension of that, really.
But what about what's inside my head?
I'm not sure they can get inside your head just yet. But if we take, for example, a fireman, I've seen firemen who are trained to actually deal with a fire that may be in a building by simulating it in advance with AR and VR immersive reality tools. If you can then simulate those sort of scenarios for different workplace activities, maybe some retail experiences and beyond, you start to open up new markets, which are actually very powerful. But we do need to consider accessibility and inclusion along the way.
Well, and I think the beauty of this is that because we will choose, and in fact, there's an interesting gaming piece to think about in here, is that everyone assumes that everyone's going to be fully immersed in gaming, wearing virtual headsets and whatever. But actually, people go and watch people playing esports and the like, don't they, in the big stadia, and consuming it via audio, via video, not necessarily fully immersed in it. So there is a range of levels of interaction. And I think this takes me to one of the pieces I mentioned in the report, is that actually, as humans, we've evolved from, grunting and gesturing, and we've gone through the creation of signs, and then we've gone through alphabets, and then we've computerized it, and we've sort of come all the way back full circle. And now we can gesture, and we can, I don't know whether we grunt at the game when we're playing the game, but there's probably something in that. There's certainly sounds in influencing it. So we have this complete range of interaction options. And I suspect as we begin to build and model the metaverse more and more deeply, that actually it allows the individual to choose how they want to communicate or how they can communicate, because we're not going to have fully 5G out into those African market, or all African markets that you mentioned earlier. So I think the options are there, and the creativity that you're quite right is what actually really excites me about this, because it suddenly says actually the tracking of all of these interactions in the future is so important. I mean, it's a massive job to keep, let alone we talked about security and fraud in the last session, but keeping a track of all those interactions in the future so we can log it and go back and perhaps any legal issues on those things in the future is a massive issue.
Have you followed some parts of the World Cup recently?
Actually, I think they just told me France just went through. Actually, I just heard that. Right here.
Thanks for sharing that. For those who wanted to see the score,
anybody who's watching it later. Yeah.
But if you see what FIFA do in terms of statistics, they're already providing a lot of statistics collection in the stadium, largely for the teams. Now, actually, starting to extend the spectator experience with statistics is quite an interesting thing to do. Starting to think about connected stadia. What would that really look like? Not where you're only on one network because they sponsor the stadium, but where coverage is taken for granted and it becomes part of the spectator experience. Start to see video playback in your seat or on your phone of your star player in the arena. Start to be able to interact with the screen in the stadium. Have a fully connected stadia, so it becomes a much more connected and entertaining experience. Clearly, it also offers options where people who can't be in the stadium for whatever reason might have a better experience at home or wherever they want to follow it.
And interestingly, obviously I don't watch the TV anymore. Listening to one of the matches the other day, one of the England commentators was in the crowd behind the goal.
Yeah.
His quality of audio was so good, coming from within a crowd with noise suppression and the like. And I was talking to Orange yesterday, and Orange is saying they have a stadium application with 5G where you can dedicate a channel to somebody with a hearing impairment and actually focus that channel to that individual, so they get the commentary. Yeah. So I think we are seeing that. We've also seen examples. A company that you and I both know, Mike, Give Vision, where they're actually trying to take the feed from the media van in the car park and feed it to a tablet, so someone with some sight can actually enjoy it on the tablet there. Now, of course, given the right connectivity, they can enjoy it at home as well. So, yeah, I think that fully immersive, being able to enjoy it. In fact, I was up in Sweden 2 weeks ago, and one of the examples they used there was you could actually be the goalkeeper in an ice hockey match and watch the person coming towards you with the stick about to shoot the puck at you. And I said, I think you got the wrong way around. I think I'd want to be the guy shooting the puck. I wouldn't want to be the one experiencing the puck flying at me at whatever speed. So, yes, I think that sort of stepping into other people's shoes, experiencing the world through other people's eyes, if they work, is a massive issue.
Well, I was in India 2 weeks ago, and when you see the huge cricket stadium they have there and the excitement in the crowd, but actually some of the technology is facilitating a lot more excitement than they've ever seen before, and in capacity as well, because not everybody can be in the ground, sharing experiences offline in all sorts of different ways.
Yeah, and I think it will help business. Now, we have a couple of minutes left. Susan, Daria, any questions in the audience there?
Thank you.
She could have said, no, let's go straight to drinks.
So my father became mobility impaired about 10, 15 years ago, and he now works for a charity in that space. And so it's really interesting to hear.
You're on.
Yeah.
You're on.
It's really interesting to hear about how some of the very futuristic and maybe exclusive things such as the metaverse can be applied into the real world. Is that happening enough? Is there enough to support people here and now?
Well, I think that's where we sort of started at the beginning, wasn't it, Mike? That, excuse me, that the journeys have been very separate. So the hearing impaired community and the vision impaired community, very, very separate, as you know, charitable sectors as well. And therefore funding, actually it's very interesting. I used to chair a cross-charity group called Technology for Life, which was across all the vision impaired charities. And they wouldn't talk to each other about what they were doing because they were trying to get funding off Microsoft and off Cisco and off loads of different people. So there's even fighting within the different sectors, within the different charitable sectors, because they need funding. The good news is, and thanks to a lot of the work that Mike initiated 10 years ago, that the sort of mobile centricity of it, and of course an extension of that to the home networking market, the smart speaker market, the smarter televisions, and in future, of course, smart buildings and smart homes. Actually, it's becoming a more generic, I don't want to call it consumer electronics, but it's in that sort of area. And the expectation is that connectivity will be available for people in order to get access to the services. So honestly, from my point of view, it has come on leaps and bounds from when I was a student, when I literally had to send photocopies away to be recorded and they came back on cassettes, not reel to reel, I'm not that old, but came back on cassettes so I could then consume it. I now get all the newspapers every day in a feed from the RNIB. I get all the industry news feeds coming through, and I can read all of those through my ears. My kids say I read through my ears, but so yes, the answer is we've made massive progress, and the technology in the hearing impaired world has changed dramatically. And I jokingly said about what's going on inside of my head. There are now trials underway. We talked about brain-computer interface probably 10, 15 years ago. There are now some, I find quite scary to be honest, issues where through sensors on the head, you can actually begin to pick up brainwaves, which would allow people with locked-in syndrome and the like to actually be able to communicate. So if you think what Stephen Hawking used to do by twitching his cheek muscle, you can accelerate that many, many fold through a brain-computer interface. But I haven't seen it work. I'm still a little bit skeptical. And Mike, any thoughts on that?
Well, I think that's correct, but I think we're not at the end of the journey yet. I mean, there's still more to be done, and that's, I think, the other message we're trying to convey. I think some of the leading charities offer great advice for a particular condition. RNIB offers great advice for the blind, RNID equivalent for the deaf. But for mobility, I think that's a bit more spread and dispersed. I do some work with Imperial College on dementia care, and they are using certain mobile and digital techniques to help with memory joggers, so music from the past, photographs from the past. So there's some good research as well as some good charity work. But I think there's still some more work to be done when you consider all the senses. And if you're mobility or dexterity challenged, there are still a few issues there.
And Mike, I think the other thing which is really important to mention is that because the sort of virtual reality headset that we see today, the Oculus and the other things, the miniaturization of that, and that's also parallel development in the visually impaired world as well. The miniaturization of that down to a pair of glasses like this is really where we need to go. And of course, that's what the mainstream market wants because they want that for the gaming world, for the Facebook taking your pictures and do whatever else. But then on top of that, the wearables market, with the combination of all the haptic feedback. I was talking to Professor Rahim Tawazali down at the University of Surrey about a 6G project he's working on, where he's got a virtual reality, a haptic glove, and a virtual reality headset to be able to do a remote patient examination on an elderly person in a care home. I mean, just think of the implications of what I just said in that sentence. The ability to do remote medical care, social care, to be able to, so the feedback comes through that haptic combination of haptic and all of the 3D video that Mike talked about earlier. So it is happening. There are pieces that need to be put in place. But I would say we've come on leaps and bounds in the last 10 years. I'm sure we'll see equal leaps in the next 5 to 10 years as well. Any final comments, Michael?
There is one.
There's another question.
Just had a question. I was wondering, how do you find?
You're not quite on the mic.
This one works.
Okay, I was wondering, how do you find Google directions? So because I don't find them so easy myself, so I was wondering, how do you find them? Is there anything that could be improved in them that would help people like yourself?
Massively.
Okay.
Yeah, if I'll happily talk you through all of the places I've gone wrong over a drink afterwards. But in terms of what it gives you, and you think about the systems behind that, and GPS and the like, the accuracy is it 10 square meters, Mike? I think it's something like that.
Yeah.
With the next generation, it'll be 10 square centimeters. So I will actually be able to avoid a bollard and not need Varley here to get me around the bollard. That's the theory. I'd rather have Varley and get me around the bollard anyway. But generally, the tools like Google Maps are excellent. They still lack that absolute accuracy needed. So you don't. Well, last night I was going to watch the football at a friend's house, and it told me I'd arrived at my destination, and I knew I hadn't because it was nothing like the right place. So there are some enhancements, but that's the sort of thing that Google and Facebook and Apple and everyone, they're all working on. So the accuracy is really important. And, and getting the information, do I get it through my ear? Do I get a haptic feedback through a watch? Do I wear more haptic and tactile clothing in the future? All these things are possible.
Plugged into your brain.
Sorry?
Or is it Elon style plugged into your brain?
Yeah, exactly. Well, he's already got into my brain quite a lot anyway. So.
Chris, we have 3 people from Google next door in the reception, so you can go and give them feedback. Yeah. We have one question online, and then that's it.
So one more, and we only have, we're out of time now, so we'll have to do this one quickly enough, but it says, the metaverse technology can be expensive. How do you make it more accessible for PWD people, and how can the telecom industry help?
Well, I think the start point has to be standards. The standards do not exist for the metaverse or Web 3.0 fully yet. Once standardized, the R&D needs to be spread across many markets and many countries. But I think you'll find that the interest in 3D and holograms will grow rather rapidly, and that will help to create the volume. And really, people with disabilities need to benefit from the economies of scale that come with that. But it has to be designed in from the beginning. Hence the importance of the report Chris has written, hence that as a reminder.
Yeah. And I think it's the fact that we're talking about the metaverse today. As an industry, we get obsessed about a thing which is really going to impact in 10 years. I mean, take 5G as an example. How long would we be talking about 5G? And it's impacting us sort of now after a long lead time. So these things, we have to get to that miniaturization. It'll get to a mass scale market. The affordability of smart speakers, think of the implication behind what a smart speaker does today in the home. The help that is to people, add a bit of vision onto it so people can actually communicate using video and sign language and so on. We have come a long way in the last 10 years. And as we miniaturize and scale up all those things in the metaverse, and we keep all the labeling, as Mike said, up to date and the standards in place, then it will benefit everybody. And it's a commercial opportunity. It's not just a societal issue. It benefits everybody. Mike, am I done now? Any more questions?
No more questions.
No. Mike, always a pleasure. Thank you so much for all the work you've done in the area. Thank you for your contribution today. And thanks everyone. Let's go and have a drink.
Darius, can I just say some final words and then we'll get
Are you going to stay here? Well, first of all, aren't they good? Well, it probably came as one of our highlights for us in terms of your knowledge is really impressive. And we wanted to trickle your imaginations. If so far this industry was about communications and the capacity or the capabilities of devices almost, what does your client can do? Now here's also the capability, the capacity of our humans out there that are going to be using it. So you've done so much. You could do so much more. I'm excited for what might be coming from you guys. So very big thank you for everybody for staying here. I do it bit by bit, but today I'd like to also say a big thank you to James because he's been putting it together. Thank you. We did say that we should drink our own champagne. So we MEF have got our own conversational channel. So you're all very welcome to join in on the fun, whether it's WhatsApp, SMS, or RCS. I believe we have a result of a little test, a little game we're playing with you. Say, answer the questions. You also can find agenda and everything else. Can we have the results out there? If not, I think there's a great slides in them for you, everybody, to be shared. If not, I will read it out. Well, why that happens? I would remind you that tomorrow we'll have another full packed day. So do come here and come enjoy the second day of NAF Connect's omni-channel. Later, we're going to be ushered around in a probably quite brisk way because there's a lot of drinks on the other side. So don't get lost. It's just where we were last night for our AGM, if you were with us. But because I can't see the results as yet, I think I'm going to try and read it out for you. Have you seen how...
Dario, I can do it. I've got it right here.
You got it there.
So very simply, we asked, what is omnichannel messaging being used for? Marketing, transactional, informative use cases. And the winner was, absolutely, we know it, transactional in the market. And 72% said transactional, trailing way behind that with around 30 was marketing and a very, very low percentage informative. There we have it. So nothing unexpected there.
There we go. We got your icebreaker, kind of, for your drinks. But let's not do anything else apart from give a round of applause for everybody so far, including Mike and Chris and everybody with the presentation. We'll see you tomorrow. Thanks again.